The tension in our house had grown so thick that I could almost feel it pressing against my skin when I walked through the front door. I'd just come home from another long day of combing through financial records at the firm, tracing funds through shell companies, but all I wanted was to unwind with Sarah over dinner. Instead, the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The house was too quiet, the air too still, like it was waiting for something to shatter. "Hey, I'm home," I called, dropping my briefcase by the door. There was no response, but I heard the faint hum of Sarah's voice drifting from her office down the hall. I followed the sound, finding her with her back to me, phone pressed to her ear. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard my footsteps, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before she flashed me a strained smile. "Yeah, I'll have to call you back," she murmured into the phone, then quickly ended the call, setting it down on her desk. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Sarah forced a laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course. Just a client who can't make up their mind about some design choices. You know how it is?" I nodded, trying to play it off, but a familiar unease settled in my gut. She'd been using that same excuse more and more lately. Late nights at her office, last-minute meetings with clients whose names she never mentioned. And while she'd always been passionate about her work, it was clear that something else had taken up residence behind her usual enthusiasm. "You seem tired," I said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe we should take a weekend off soon. Just the two of us." She hesitated, just for a moment, then turned away, shuffling some papers on her desk. "Yeah, maybe. It's just not a good time right now, too many projects on the go. You know how it is, right?" I replied, but the knot in my chest tightened. She was slipping away, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I wandered the house, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. I drifted into the living room, flipping through the day's mail on the coffee table, looking for a distraction. Bills, flyers, an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. And then I saw it. A plain, cream-colored envelope with Sarah's name on it, the sender's name printed neatly in the corner. Crawford and Mills, attorneys at law. I frowned, turning the envelope over in my hands. Sarah never mentioned any legal matters, and the name didn't ring a bell. I knew I shouldn't open it. This was her business, after all. But the unease gnawing at my chest made me tear open the flap before I could think better of it. Inside, I found a letter and a thin stack of documents. The first page was a summary of a financial transaction, a wire transfer of a significant sum, just under $50,000, to an account held by a man named Victor Kane. The name meant nothing to me, but the rest of the letter made my stomach twist. It was from a lawyer, confirming that the transfer had been completed in accordance with Ms. Hartley's instructions. I read through it again, then a third time, my mind racing. Why would Sarah be transferring that kind of money to a stranger? And why hadn't she mentioned any of this to me? I glanced toward the stairs, listening for any sound from the bedroom. My heart thudded in my chest as I snapped a photo of the letter with my phone and slipped the documents back into the envelope, trying to arrange everything as neatly as I'd found it. I told myself I'd put it out of my mind until I had a chance to ask her about it. But even as I climbed the stairs to bed, my mind spun with questions. The next morning, I sat across from Sarah at the breakfast table, forcing myself to act normal. She read the news on her tablet, sipping coffee, while I watched her from the corner of my eye. It would be so easy to ask her about the letter now, to demand an explanation. But the words stuck in my throat. She glanced up, catching me watching her, and smiled. "What's on your mind?" I shrugged, forcing a smile of my own. "Just thinking about work. I've got a new case that's a bit of a puzzle." "Well, you've always liked a challenge," she said lightly, but there was a flicker of something in her expression, something wary. She got up to refill her coffee, and I watched as she passed the pile of mail on the counter without a second glance. The letter from Crawford and Mills was buried underneath, exactly where I'd left it. For a moment, I wondered if she even remembered putting it there, or if she'd hoped I wouldn't notice it at all. I finished my breakfast in silence, waiting until she left for her office before I pulled out my phone. I stared at the photo of the wire transfer letter, feeling like I was staring at a piece of a puzzle that didn't belong. But I knew I couldn't let it go. That afternoon, During a break at work, I called Mark, an old friend from my auditing days who now ran his own PI firm. He was good at finding things other people wanted to keep hidden. I explained the situation, keeping my voice low as I spoke into my phone in an empty conference room. Her name is Sarah Hartley, and the guy she wired money to, his name's Victor Kane. I don't know if there's anything shady about it, but can you look into him for me? Mark chuckled on the other end. A wire transfer to some random guy? That's not usually a good sign, David. But sure, I'll dig around. Give me a day or two. Thanks, Mark. And, keep it quiet, okay? Yeah, I know the drill. I'll be in touch. I hung up, slipping my phone back into my pocket, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I told myself that maybe there was an innocent explanation, that Sarah's connection to Victor was some kind of business arrangement I hadn't known about. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that she was hiding something big enough that she'd gone to lengths to keep me in the dark. As I drove home that evening, the photo of the wire transfer letter felt like a weight in my pocket, a secret threatening to spill into the open. And as I pulled into the driveway, I glanced up at the warm lights glowing through the windows of our house and wondered if they'd ever feel the same again. Mark called me back 2 days later, just as I was starting to lose patience. I sat in my car in the office parking garage, listening to the rumble of distant traffic while his voice crackled through my phone. David, you might want to sit down for this, he said, and I could hear the tension in his voice. This Victor Kane guy? He's got a pretty shady history. I found some stuff that doesn't look good. Real estate deals gone wrong, accusations of fraud. The guy's been investigated a few times for money laundering, but nothing's ever stuck. He's got a reputation for being slippery. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. What does he have to do with Sarah? Mark hesitated. I don't know yet. But here's the thing. He owns a bunch of shell companies, and one of them has been making regular deposits into a private account. That account matches the one Sarah used for the wire transfer you mentioned. It's like they're moving money back and forth under the radar. A cold knot formed in my chest. What are you saying, Mark? That my wife is laundering money for him? I don't know if it's laundering, Mark replied, his tone cautious. But she's definitely tied to him financially, and not in a casual way. The amounts are significant, too big to just be a loan or a favor. I'd say she's in deep, David. I sat there, the hum of the car's engine filling the silence between us. My mind spun with questions, but I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that my Sarah, was mixed up in something illegal. It didn't make sense. She'd always been meticulous with her finances, and she wasn't the type to take risks, especially not with shady characters like Victor. Mark interrupted my thoughts, his voice turning serious. Listen, if you want my advice, you should confront her. See what she says when you bring up the money. If she's hiding something, she'll slip up. I clenched my jaw, thinking of the letter I'd found, the way Sarah had deflected when I asked about her late nights. Confronting her now felt too soon, too risky. Not yet, Mark. Keep digging. See if there's any more dirt on Victor. Your call, Mark said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. But be careful, David. People like Victor don't like being exposed, and if Sarah's involved with him, you could end up in the crossfire. I thanked him and hung up, but the warning lingered in my mind. If Victor had connections that ran deep enough to dodge multiple investigations, then going after him could mean playing with fire. And if Sarah was wrapped up in it too, I didn't know where the danger might come from. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, some piece of the puzzle that would make everything make sense. I paced the house after Sarah went to bed, the old floorboards creaking under my feet. My thoughts kept returning to the letter, the wire transfer, the shadowy figure of Victor Kane. Every time I looked at Sarah, I saw new questions behind her tired smiles, wondering if she'd ever really let me see the whole truth. I found myself standing outside her office, my hand hovering over the door handle. I hesitated for a moment, guilt twisting in my gut, but then I turned the knob and slipped inside. Her desk was cluttered with design sketches and fabric samples, the space a perfect reflection of the creative mind she'd always been. But I wasn't here to admire her work. I was here to find answers. I searched through the drawers, rifling through old invoices and client files, careful not to leave any trace of my snooping. Most of it was standard business paperwork, but then I found something tucked away at the back of the bottom drawer, a small, unmarked USB drive. I held it up to the light, wondering if this could be the key to unlocking whatever Sarah was hiding. Without thinking too much about the consequences, I slipped the USB drive into my pocket and crept back upstairs. I plugged it into my laptop in the study, my heart thudding in my chest as the drive's contents appeared on the screen. There were a dozen files, most of them encrypted, but a few folders were accessible. Inside, I found PDFs of architectural plans and blueprints, designs for luxury properties, high-end penthouses, and mansions. At first, I thought they might be Sarah's design work, but then I noticed the notes in the margins. They weren't about aesthetics or layouts. They were about security systems, mentions of blind spots, guard rotations, and key code access. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the files, each one more incriminating than the last. There were floor plans for properties I recognized as being owned by Victor's development company. But why would Sarah need detailed information about security access points? As I went through the last folder, I found a set of recent photographs, images of a sleek, modern house that I didn't recognize. The photos showed every angle of the property, focusing on entrances, windows, and alarm systems. I realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just about design. It was about getting in, bypassing the protections that were supposed to keep people out. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I stared at the screen. This was evidence of something far more serious than a simple financial arrangement. If Sarah had been gathering this kind of information, it meant she was involved in a criminal operation, something that involved breaking into properties, bypassing security systems. And with Victor's history, it didn't take much to connect the dots. I shut the laptop and pulled out the USB drive, my hands trembling. The thought of Sarah, my wife, being a part of this made my head spin. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was staring me in the face, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I watched Sarah closely, looking for any sign that she suspected I'd been in her office. But she acted the same as always, sipping her coffee and scrolling through emails on her phone. She even hummed a little as she got ready for work, as if she didn't have a care in the world. I wanted to confront her, to throw the USB drive on the table and demand answers. But the memory of Mark's warning held me back. If I pushed too hard, I might tip my hand too soon, and if she really was working with Victor, she might try to cover her tracks before I could figure out what they were planning. So instead, I kept my expression neutral, pretending that everything was normal as I kissed her goodbye and watched her drive off to her office. The moment she was gone, I grabbed my phone and called Mark again, telling him what I'd found on the USB drive. His reaction was immediate. "You need to get out of there, David. If she's mixed up in a heist or something, and Victor finds out you've been snooping, I'm not running away." I cut in, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not yet. I need more information. I need to know what they're planning." Mark sighed, but I could hear the concern in his voice. "Okay, I'll see what else I can dig up on Victor's recent deals. But you're playing a dangerous game, David. Don't get yourself in too deep." I ended the call, knowing that I was already in deeper than I'd ever imagined. But I couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was so close, just out of reach. That afternoon, while at the office, I got a text from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat as I read the message. "You're being watched, David. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. It was the same warning Mark had given me, but now it felt like a threat, something more personal. I glanced around the office, half expecting to see someone watching me, but all I saw were my colleagues, lost in their own worlds. I deleted the message and slipped my phone back into my pocket, trying to ignore the knot of fear tightening in my chest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that whatever game Sarah and Victor were playing, I was now a part of it, whether I liked it or not. And as I drove home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty streets, I made a promise to myself. I would get to the bottom of this. I would find out what Sarah was hiding, even if it meant risking everything. But deep down, I knew that whatever I found, it would change everything. I spent the next few days walking a razor's edge, trying to act like everything was normal while the tension inside me coiled tighter. Every time I looked at Sarah, I saw the fragments of the life we'd built together and the cracks that had formed beneath the surface, where secrets festered. She smiled and kissed me goodnight, but I couldn't forget the USB drive hidden in my jacket pocket, the floor plans and security notes that pointed to something dark. Mark called me back with an update, just as I was finishing up a long afternoon of meetings. I locked my office door before answering, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did you find?" Mark sighed on the other end, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "David, this is bad. Victor's got more than just a history of fraud. He's been tied to some high-stakes robberies over the past few years, break-ins at luxury properties where security systems were bypassed. The police could never pin it on him directly, but he's always been a person of interest. If he's working with Sarah," he didn't finish the thought, but I knew what he meant. Sarah wasn't just involved with Victor. She was helping him orchestrate the kind of heist I'd only read about in the news. My mind raced, trying to piece together how she could have gotten caught up in something like this. But every answer I came up with only led to more questions. "Does she know what he's really involved in?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice tight with concern. "But if she's been gathering intel on security systems, she's not as innocent as you might want to believe. You need to be careful, David. This isn't just about your marriage anymore. This is about your safety." I thanked him, but his words lingered long after I'd hung up. Mark was right. This had gone beyond a marital betrayal. It was about survival now, about figuring out how deep Sarah's involvement went and whether she was capable of hurting me to protect herself. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I poured myself a drink and went back into her office. I knew it was risky. If she caught me, it would be impossible to explain, but the unease inside me was too strong to ignore. I had to know what else she was hiding. I searched through her desk drawers again, careful to replace everything exactly as I'd found it. Most of the papers were the same as before, design sketches, client invoices. But then I found something new, a black leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a stack of old receipts. My pulse quickened as I flipped through it, my hands trembling. The notebook was filled with entries in Sarah's neat handwriting, detailing meetings with Victor, notes about his properties, and cryptic references to the job and timelines. But it wasn't just business. There were entries about me, too. Comments about my work schedule, my routines, the nights I'd stayed late at the office. I froze when I saw one entry dated 2 weeks ago. "David's been distracted with his audits. Keeps asking about late nights. Victor thinks he's getting too curious. We need to keep him out of this until the job's done." I stared at the words, the air rushing out of my lungs. She'd been monitoring me, making sure I didn't dig too deep into whatever she and Victor were planning. I closed the notebook, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind was racing. If she thought I was a threat, how far would she go to protect her secrets? I slipped the notebook back into the drawer and hurried back to the bedroom, slipping under the covers beside Sarah. She stirred in her sleep, mumbling something, and I lay there in the dark, trying to make sense of the person lying next to me. She had always been so good at reading people and knowing exactly what to say to calm their nerves. How much of our life together had been real, and how much of it had been another one of her carefully constructed facades. The next morning, I decided it was time to push back. If Sarah and Victor thought they could keep me in the dark, they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me any longer. I drove to the cafe where I'd seen Sarah meet Victor before, parking a few blocks away and watching from a distance. It wasn't long before I spotted her car pulling into the lot. She stepped out, glancing around with a wary look before heading inside. 15 minutes later, Victor arrived, wearing his usual tailored jacket and dark sunglasses. I snapped photos of them through the window, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I caught them sitting across from each other, their faces tense. But my satisfaction faded as I saw the expression on Sarah's face through the lens. She looked scared. The way she leaned in, her hands clasped tightly together, reminded me of the way she'd looked the night she confessed her fears about her business struggling. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Maybe she hadn't wanted this, but had been drawn into it by Victor's threats and promises. I lowered the camera, trying to ignore the doubt gnawing at my chest. If she was trapped, why hadn't she come to me? Why had she hidden everything from me instead of trusting me to help her? I stayed outside the cafe, waiting for Victor to leave. As soon as he was gone, I slipped inside, catching Sarah as she paid the check. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and for a second, panic flashed across her face before she forced a smile. "David, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "I could ask you the same thing, Sarah. What's going on between you and Victor?" Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "It's just business. He's a client, like I told you. Why are you following me?" I pulled out my phone, showing her the photos I'd taken. "Because you've been lying to me. I know about the wire transfers, the late-night meetings, and the blueprints. What are you and Victor planning, Sarah?" Her face went pale, and she took a step back, her hand clutching the edge of the counter. "David, you don't understand. I'm trying to keep you safe. By feeding Victor information about me," I demanded, my voice rising. "I found the notebook, Sarah. You've been spying on me. How is that supposed to keep me safe?" Sarah's face blanched when I mentioned the notebook, her composure slipping for the first time. She stared at me, wide-eyed, like she was trying to decide whether to keep lying or to tell me the truth. For a moment, I thought she might break down, confess everything right there in the cafe. But instead, she clenched her jaw and looked away, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "You had no right to go through my things," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what's at stake here, David. This is bigger than you and me." I stepped closer, trying to keep my voice steady, even as anger bubbled beneath the surface. "Then make me understand, because all I see is you working with a criminal and hiding money in secret accounts. All I see is the woman I married turning into someone I can't even recognize." She flinched, and for a moment, I thought I saw a crack in her facade. But then she straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with a defiance that made my stomach twist. "You don't get it, do you? Victor, he's not the kind of man you can just walk away from. He has leverage over me, over both of us." "Leverage?" I repeated, my mind racing. "What kind of leverage?" She looked around the cafe, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer, her voice barely more than a breath. "He found out about the accounts, our savings, our investments. He threatened to ruin us if I didn't help him. I tried to keep you out of it, but you kept pushing, kept digging." "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Just tell me the truth. Are you helping him plan a break-in? Is that what the security plans are for?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting away, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I felt a cold knot form in my chest, the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place. The wire transfers, the notes about security systems, they weren't just a desperate attempt to pay off a blackmailer. She'd been actively involved in helping Victor plan something that could destroy us both if it went wrong. "I didn't have a choice," she said finally, her voice cracking. "He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd make sure you lost everything. Your job, your reputation. He said he'd make you look like you were involved too." I took a step back, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. "And instead of coming to me, you decided to work with him? To keep feeding him information about me?" She reached out, grabbing my arm, her expression desperate. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep you safe without dragging you into this mess. But it's gotten out of control, David. He's planning something big, and if we don't stop him..." "Stop him?" I cut in, pulling my arm away from her grasp. "What are you talking about, Sarah? You're in this up to your neck. If he's planning something, you're just as much a part of it as he is." She looked like I'd slapped her, but I didn't have time to feel guilty. I turned and walked out of the cafe, ignoring her calling after me. I needed to clear my head to figure out what my next move would be. But even as I stormed down the sidewalk, I could still feel her eyes on me, like she was trying to burn her fear into my back. When I got back to the office, my mind was still reeling, but I knew I needed to focus. I called Mark from my desk, my hands shaking as I recounted the conversation with Sarah. "She's scared, Mark. She says Victor is planning something big, and he's using her to make it happen." Mark swore under his breath, his frustration bleeding through the line. "Sounds like she's in deeper than we thought. If she's helping him plan a break-in, that means we're talking about serious criminal charges. And if he's using her as leverage, she might try to pin everything on him to save herself." I stared out the window, my thoughts racing. What do I do, Mark? How do I make sure she doesn't drag me down with her? You need leverage of your own, he said firmly. If you can get her to admit her involvement on tape or catch Victor making threats, you might be able to use it to force their hand. Otherwise, you're at their mercy. The idea of recording Sarah made my stomach turn, but I knew he was right. She'd already kept too much from me, and I couldn't trust her to tell the full story. If I had any hope of getting out of this, I needed to start thinking like the people I'd spent my career exposing, like a man willing to do whatever it took to protect himself. That night, I waited until Sarah had gone to bed, then slipped back into her office. I found the USB drive where I'd hidden it, plugging it into my laptop one last time. I scrolled through the encrypted files, feeling the weight of each new discovery settle into my bones. The floor plans, the notes about security codes, they all pointed to a single target, a luxury penthouse in one of Victor's new developments, scheduled to be completed in a few weeks. As I stared at the plans, a horrifying realization took shape in my mind. Victor wasn't just planning a break-in. He was planning to rob the penthouse before it officially opened, using Sarah's knowledge of the building's design to bypass the security systems. It was the perfect crime, one that would leave no trace once the building was occupied. And if Sarah was caught up in it, that meant she knew exactly how he planned to do it. I shut the laptop, trying to steady my breathing. If I went to the police now, there was a chance they wouldn't believe me. Without concrete proof, without something that tied Victor to the heist, Sarah could twist the story to make it look like I was the one trying to cover my tracks. I needed more. I needed a way to make sure that when the truth came out, it wouldn't take me down with it. The next day, I told Sarah I'd be working late, then drove to the address listed for Victor's development company. I parked a few blocks away and waited, watching the entrance. A few minutes later, I saw Victor's sleek black car pull up, and he got out, disappearing into the building. My heart pounded as I slipped out of my car and followed, keeping to the shadows. I didn't have a plan beyond catching him off guard. But as I watched him from the alley behind his office, I heard something that sent a chill through my veins. Victor's voice, muffled through the glass but laced with anger. She's getting cold feet. If she doesn't deliver those codes, I'll make sure she regrets it. I pulled out my phone, recording the conversation as best as I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that he was pressuring Sarah, using her to get access to the building. It was the leverage I needed, something that might keep him from turning the tables on me. As I listened to him continue, my anger burned hotter. This man had drawn my wife into a dangerous game, using her fears and insecurities to manipulate her. But even as the anger roared inside me, I couldn't ignore the bitter truth that kept creeping into my thoughts. Sarah had let him do it. She had lied to me, hidden things from me, until it was too late to turn back. I left before Victor finished his phone call, slipping back into the shadows and driving away. But as I sped down the empty streets, a new plan began to form in my mind. If I could use the recording to force Victor's hand, I might be able to turn him against Sarah, make him desperate enough to cut a deal, to implicate her in the heist. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could backfire and drag me down with them. But it was the only way I could see out of this mess, a way to get justice without sacrificing everything I'd worked for. When I got home, I found Sarah waiting for me in the living room, her face shadowed with worry. She didn't ask where I'd been, but I could see the question in her eyes, the suspicion that lingered between us like smoke. I sat down across from her, trying to ignore the weight of the recording in my pocket. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. "You need to tell me everything, Sarah. No more lies." She hesitated, biting her lip, but then she nodded slowly. "Okay, but promise me whatever happens, you'll give me a chance to explain." I didn't promise. I just leaned forward, my heart pounding, as she began to talk. Sarah sat across from me, her face drawn and pale as she finally began to open up. She took a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It started months ago when Victor approached me about working on his properties. He said he'd heard about my design firm, that he liked my work, but then he brought up the idea of security enhancements, ways to make his developments more exclusive. I listened in silence, my jaw clenched tight, resisting the urge to cut in. She glanced at me, as if expecting me to interrupt, but when I didn't, she continued. I thought it was just a way to add value to his properties, but then he started asking for more, detailed plans of the security systems, access codes, information I didn't feel comfortable giving him. When I tried to back out, he changed tactics. He started asking about you, about your work. He said he could ruin both of us if I didn't cooperate. She looked away, blinking rapidly, and I caught a glimpse of the fear she'd been hiding. I thought if I played along, if I gave him what he wanted, he'd leave us alone. But he kept pushing. He said he needed my help with one last job before he'd let me walk away. I leaned forward, unable to hold back any longer. And that job is the heist, isn't it? He's planning to rob one of his own penthouses before the security systems are fully operational. And you've been helping him every step of the way. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I felt a wave of anger surge through me, the betrayal twisting like a knife in my gut. So what now, Sarah? Were you planning to take the fall if it all went wrong? Or did you think he'd let you disappear with him? Her head snapped up, her expression stricken. No, David, you don't understand. I've been trying to gather information to find something I could use to turn against him. I didn't want this, but he wouldn't let me go. I let out a harsh laugh, the sound bitter even to my own ears. And you expect me to believe that after everything? You lied to me. You hid things from me. You spied on me. Why should I trust a word you say? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, her voice shaking. Because I'm telling you now. Because I'm asking for your help, David. If we work together, we can stop him. We can turn him in before he does something that can't be undone. She reached out, placing her hand over mine, her grip surprisingly strong. Please, I know I don't deserve your trust, but you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this to happen. For a long moment, I stared at her, my mind torn between anger and something dangerously close to pity. I wanted to hate her for what she'd done, for the lies that had poisoned our life together. But beneath the desperation in her eyes, I saw a glimmer of the woman I used to know, the woman who'd built a life with me, who'd once shared my dreams. I pulled my hand away, the cold weight of the recording in my pocket reminding me of the stakes. Fine, we'll work together, but if you're lying to me again, I swear, I won't protect you. I'll take this to the police myself. She nodded quickly, a flicker of hope lighting in her expression. I understand. I won't lie to you again. But as I watched her, I couldn't help wondering if she'd just told me her biggest lie yet. The next few days passed in a blur as Sarah and I worked on our plan, gathering what information we could on Victor's operation. She told me about the penthouse he was targeting, a luxury apartment in one of his newest developments, and how he planned to use her access codes to disable the security systems just long enough for his men to break in. I recorded everything she told me, playing the role of the cooperative husband while keeping my own plans hidden. I still had the recording of Victor's threats, and I knew that if things went south, it would be my best chance to turn the tables on both of them. But as we worked together, I could feel the old rhythms of our relationship slipping back into place, the unspoken familiarity that had once made us strong. There were moments when I almost believed her, when I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. But then I'd remember the notebook, the secrets she'd kept, and the doubt would settle back into my chest like a stone. The night of the meeting with Victor came sooner than I expected. Sarah had arranged for us to meet him at an abandoned warehouse near the waterfront, where he liked to conduct his more discreet business dealings. She told me that she'd convinced him to believe that we had no choice but to go along with his plan, that we were too afraid to do anything else. As we drove to the warehouse, the streets dark and empty around us, I glanced at her in the passenger seat, wondering if she was as scared as she seemed. She kept wringing her hands, her eyes darting toward me, but she said nothing. I knew she had a lot to lose tonight. If Victor caught on that we were planning to turn him in, he wouldn't hesitate to make us pay for it. We pulled up outside the warehouse, and I reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the voice recorder I'd hidden there. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, making sure it was switched on before I turned to Sarah. Remember, you stick to the story. We act like we're desperate, like we're too scared to do anything but help him. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. I know. I won't mess this up. I studied her for a moment longer, searching for any hint of deception, but all I saw was fear. Whether it was fear of Victor or fear of me, I couldn't be sure. Inside the warehouse, Victor was waiting for us, leaning against a stack of crates with a smirk on his face. He straightened as we approached, his eyes narrowing as he looked between me and Sarah. "You're late." I forced a shaky laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sorry, we had some things to work out, but we're here now, and Sarah's got everything you asked for." Victor's gaze flicked to Sarah, who quickly pulled out a small USB drive and held it out to him. "This has the codes you need to disable the security systems," she said, her voice barely trembling. "It's everything you asked for." Victor took the drive, turning it over in his hand with a look of satisfaction. "Smart move, both of you. And don't worry, after this is done, you'll never see me again." He looked back up at me, his expression turning smug. "But you know, David, I expected better from you. Letting your wife do the dirty work? It's a shame." I swallowed back the anger that rose in my throat. "I'm doing what I have to, Victor. Just like you." He laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the warehouse. "You're not like me, David. You're a coward, hiding behind your wife's skirts. But that's okay. You're useful to me, and that's all that matters." I forced myself to smile, but inside, I felt a cold resolve settle into place. The voice recorder in my pocket was capturing every word, building the case I needed to bring him down. And if Sarah was lying to me, if she'd planned to betray me, I'd make sure she went down with him. Victor turned back to Sarah, slipping the USB drive into his jacket. "I'll let you know when we're ready to move. Just remember, if either of you try anything, you'll regret it." He started to walk away, but before he could take more than a few steps, I took a deep breath and spoke up. "There's one more thing, Victor." He stopped, turning back with a frown. "What?" I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, and played the recording I'd made outside his office. His threats crackled through the air, filling the warehouse with the sound of his own voice. "She's getting cold feet. If she doesn't deliver those codes, I'll make sure she regrets it." Victor's expression darkened as he listened, and he took a step toward me, his face twisting with anger. "What the hell is this?" "It's leverage," I said, meeting his gaze. "You're not going to use us as your scapegoats, Victor. If this goes wrong, I'll make sure the police hear every word you've said." For a moment, the warehouse fell into a tense silence, and I could see the calculation flickering behind Victor's eyes. But then he smiled, a slow, dangerous grin that made my blood run cold. "You think you got me cornered, David? You think I don't have a plan for this?" He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek pistol, and aimed it directly at me. Sarah let out a choked gasp, and I felt my pulse spike as the world seemed to narrow to the dark barrel of the gun pointed at my chest. But before Victor could pull the trigger, Sarah lunged forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it to the side. The gun went off, the shot ringing out through the warehouse, and I felt the rush of air as the bullet passed by my ear, slamming into the wall behind me. I tackled Victor, wrestling him to the ground as the gun skittered across the concrete. Sarah scrambled for the weapon, her hands shaking as she picked it up and pointed it at Victor, her face pale with terror. Victor froze beneath me, his chest heaving, but he never lost that smug, infuriating smile. "You've made a big mistake, David. You think you're in control? This is far from over." I glanced up at Sarah, seeing the desperation in her eyes, and realized that she was waiting for me to decide what to do next. And as I looked down at the man who had tried to tear my life apart, I knew that whatever happened now, there was no going back. Victor lay on the cold concrete, his breathing heavy, eyes flicking between me and the gun in Sarah's hands. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in my ears, and I could hear my own pulse pounding like a drumbeat, but I kept my grip firm on Victor's arm, pinning him down. Sarah stood over us, the pistol trembling slightly in her grip, her face pale but determined. For a moment, none of us moved, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Victor let out a low, mocking laugh, his lips curling into a sneer. "Look at you two, playing at being the heroes. You think you could just walk away from this?" Sarah's voice wavered as she tightened her grip on the gun, pointing it directly at Victor's head. "Shut up, Victor. You don't get to threaten us anymore." He raised an eyebrow, glancing up at her with a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You're not going to shoot me, Sarah. You don't have it in you. I could see the struggle on her face, the way her hands shook, and I realized that Victor might be right. As much as she'd gotten caught up in this, as much as she'd lied and hidden things from me, she wasn't a killer. But I wasn't going to let her become one, either. I shifted my weight, pressing Victor's arm harder against the floor. We don't need to shoot you, Victor. We just need you to know that if you try anything, I'll send the recording to the police. They'll have all the evidence they need to tie you to the heist. Victor's smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. He glanced at Sarah, then back at me, the realization that he was outmaneuvered sinking in. He let out a breath, his tone turning cold. Fine, you win, David. But if you think I'm going to take the fall for this alone, you're dead wrong. Sarah lowered the gun slightly, a look of confusion flashing across her face. What do you mean? Victor's eyes gleamed with a twisted kind of satisfaction. You think I didn't prepare for this? I've got files on both of you, proof that you were helping me plan the break-in. If I go down, you're both going down with me. My stomach dropped as his words sank in, and I realized just how deep his manipulation went. He'd set this up perfectly, playing us against each other until he could use our own secrets to destroy us. I tried to keep my expression calm, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, the fragile control I'd managed to wrestle slipping through my fingers. You're bluffing, I said, but even as I spoke, I knew I didn't fully believe it. Victor let out another laugh, a dry, brittle sound. Am I? Why don't you check your wife's phone? Go on, Sarah. Tell him about the messages, the instructions I sent you. Tell him how you were supposed to frame him if things went sideways. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes widening in horror as she stared down at Victor. That's not true. I didn't what? Victor cut in, his voice sharp. Didn't save the messages? Didn't keep the evidence like I told you? You were so eager to prove yourself, Sarah, but now look where you are. I glanced at Sarah, seeing the panic flickering in her eyes, and my own anger flared. Is that true, Sarah? Did he ask you to set me up? She swallowed hard, the gun wavering in her hands. David, he made me keep track of your movements. He said it was to make sure you didn't find out too much, but You never thought I'd catch on? I finished bitterly. You never thought I'd figure out you were spying on me? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, but I couldn't tell if it was denial or desperation. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me, the woman who had claimed she was trying to protect me, had been hiding things that could ruin both of us. Victor took advantage of the distraction, trying to twist out of my grip, but I held on, slamming him back against the concrete. You're not getting away, Victor, I growled. You're going to stay right here until the police arrive. He let out a sharp, pained breath, but the glint of amusement never left his eyes. Go ahead, call them. See how much good it does you. They'll believe me, David. I've got enough dirt on you to make sure of it. I felt a surge of panic, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to think. I still had the recording of his threats, and maybe that would be enough to shift the blame onto him. But as I glanced at Sarah, I realized that I couldn't be sure where her loyalties lay. If she decided to turn on me, if she decided that Victor's plan to frame me was the only way to save herself, I met her gaze, trying to see through the layers of fear and guilt. Sarah, we have to call the police. We have to end this. She hesitated, her lips trembling, but then she nodded slowly. Okay, but you have to promise that you'll protect me, David. Please. I let out a shaky breath, knowing that this might be the last chance I had to get out of this with any semblance of control. I'll do what I can, but you have to tell them everything, no more lies. She nodded again, her face pale and stricken. I pulled out my phone, dialing Ray's number, my hands shaking as I explained the situation in quick, clipped sentences. He promised to send a team, and I hung up, my mind racing with the possibilities of how this could go wrong. The police arrived faster than I'd expected, their sirens cutting through the night as they surrounded the warehouse. Ray was among them, his face hard as he assessed the scene. He took one look at the gun in Sarah's hands and the bloodied face of Victor beneath me and gestured for his officers to cuff Victor. As they hauled Victor to his feet, he glared at me, his expression full of venom. This isn't over, David. You think you're safe? You think she's going to protect you? I ignored him, turning to Ray as they dragged Victor outside. "I've got recordings, proof that he was pressuring Sarah, threatening both of us. It's all on the drive." Ray's expression remained skeptical, but he nodded slowly. "We'll need to go through everything, David. You'll both need to come down to the station for statements." I glanced at Sarah, who was being led away by one of the officers, her face pale and drawn. I didn't know if she would stick to our story, if she would back up my version of events, or try to turn things around on me. But I knew that whatever happened next, there was no going back to the way things had been. Hours later, after giving my statement to the police, I sat alone in a sterile interrogation room, staring at the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. My hands were shaking, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and regret. Ray had promised to review the recordings, but he hadn't made any assurances about what would happen to Sarah. The door opened, and Ray stepped in, his face unreadable as he sat down across from me. "David, we've listened to the recordings. They paint a pretty damning picture of Victor. But there's one problem. Sarah's version of events doesn't match yours." I felt a jolt of panic, the floor seeming to tilt beneath me. "What do you mean?" Ray folded his arms, his expression grim. "She claims that you were the one who came up with the idea to blackmail Victor, that you wanted to double-cross him from the beginning. She says she only went along with it because she was afraid of what you might do if she refused." I shook my head, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "That's not true. She's lying. She's trying to save herself." Ray watched me closely, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe she is, but you have to understand, David, we've got her version of events, we've got Victor's claims, and we've got evidence that ties both of you to this mess. If you want to get out of this without facing charges yourself, you need to give us something more, something that proves she was working with Victor all along." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. If I couldn't prove that Sarah had been in on this from the start, I'd be left fighting for my own innocence, alone against her and Victor. And even if I managed to stay out of prison, I'd be left with nothing but the ashes of my life, the wreckage of a marriage built on lies. I felt the recording device in my pocket, the cold, hard evidence that could turn the tide. But as I thought back to the look on Sarah's face in the warehouse, the fear and desperation that had mirrored my own, I realized that I wasn't sure if I had it in me to destroy her completely. Ray leaned forward, his voice turning urgent. "What's it going to be, David? Are you going to protect yourself? Or are you going to let her drag you down with her?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical thing. And as the minutes ticked by, I realized that no matter what I chose, I was about to lose something that could never be replaced. I sat in the interrogation room, Ray's words echoing in my mind. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second stretching out as I struggled to decide what to do. I'd spent years unraveling other people's secrets, following paper trails and financial webs until I found the truth. But now, when it mattered most, I couldn't see my own way through the lies. Sarah's betrayal gnawed at me, a raw wound that I couldn't close. She'd twisted the story to save herself, just like Victor said she might. And yet, I couldn't forget the fear in her eyes at the warehouse, the way she'd turned the gun on Victor instead of on me. Part of me wanted to believe that she'd tried to protect me, that there was some sliver of the woman I'd loved still buried beneath the lies. Ray leaned closer, his patience wearing thin. "David, time's running out. Victor's got a team of lawyers coming in, and they'll tear this apart if you don't give us something solid. You know how this works. He'll spin the narrative, paint himself as the victim, and Sarah's already claiming you coerced her. The only way out is if you give us what we need to prove she's lying." I took a deep breath, reaching into my jacket pocket and feeling the cool metal of the voice recorder against my fingertips. It was all there, Victor's threats, the proof that he'd been pulling the strings. But there were other recordings too, conversations with Sarah that painted a more complicated picture, one where she wasn't just a pawn, but a willing participant. If I handed everything over, it would be the end of her. She'd go to prison for conspiracy, maybe worse, and there'd be no chance for her to salvage her life. And as much as she deserved to face the consequences, I couldn't shake the image of her broken expression when she realized how deeply she was trapped. I closed my eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Ray watched me, waiting for an answer, But I knew that no matter what I chose, I was walking away from this with blood on my hands. In the end, I made the only choice I could live with. I slid the voice recorder across the table, but I kept my grip on it, meeting Ray's gaze. I'll give you what you need to put Victor away, but you keep Sarah out of this. She's guilty, but she's not like him. She doesn't deserve to be buried by his lies. Ray's eyes narrowed, studying me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll see what I can do. But you need to understand, David, this might not be enough to save her completely. If she pushed this too far, if she knew more than she's letting on. I know. I cut in, my voice rough. Just give her a chance. Please. He hesitated, then took the recorder from my hand, slipping it into his pocket. All right, but whatever happens next, you're going to have to live with it. I watched him leave the room, my chest aching with the weight of my decision. I knew that I might have just sacrificed my best chance to clear my own name. But as I sat there alone in the empty room, I told myself that maybe, just maybe, I'd done the right thing. 3 weeks later, I stood in the back of a crowded courtroom, watching as Victor was led away in handcuffs. He'd taken a plea deal, offering up the details of the heist in exchange for a reduced sentence, but it hadn't been enough to save him from facing years behind bars. The media had jumped on the story of the corrupt developer who'd used his connections to evade the law, and for once, justice had caught up with him. But Sarah's fate hadn't been as clear-cut. She'd faced charges too, less severe, but still enough to put her future in jeopardy. She'd spent days in a holding cell before being released on bail, and her trial had been a media circus. I testified on her behalf, offering up my recordings and my account of Victor's manipulation, but I knew that it wasn't enough to wipe away the choices she'd made. I'd watched her from the witness stand, trying to read the expression on her face as I spoke about the lies she'd told, the secrets she'd kept. But she'd kept her gaze down, her hands clasped tightly together, like she couldn't bear to look at me. After the sentencing, Sarah waited for me outside the courthouse, her face pale and drawn in the afternoon light. She had a few months of house arrest ahead of her, along with a mountain of legal fees and the stain of a criminal record that would follow her wherever she went. But she was free for now, and I knew that I'd played a part in that, for better or worse. She approached me slowly, her footsteps tentative, like she wasn't sure if I'd turn away. "David," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the reporters swarming around the courthouse steps. "I know you didn't have to do what you did. I know. I don't deserve it." I stared at her, feeling the distance between us like a physical thing. "You're right, Sarah. You don't." Her face crumpled, but she quickly blinked back the tears, forcing herself to stay composed. "I'll never forgive myself for what I did. But thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." I shook my head, the bitterness clawing at my throat. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I couldn't live with myself if I let Victor win." She nodded slowly, like she understood, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on us. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of reporters, leaving me alone on the courthouse steps. Months later, I found myself sitting alone in a new apartment, staring at the city lights through the window. The echoes of my old life had faded, leaving behind a hollow silence that I hadn't yet figured out how to fill. The firm had given me a leave of absence to deal with the fallout from the trial, but I knew that even if I went back, things wouldn't be the same. Every night, I replayed the events in my mind, the lies, the betrayals, the moment when everything shattered. I told myself that I'd made the right decision, that I'd done what I had to do. But the doubt never fully went away, like a shadow lurking at the edges of my thoughts. One evening, I came home to find an envelope waiting for me in the mail, addressed in Sarah's familiar handwriting. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, I found a single page with a message written in her careful script. "David, I'm leaving town for a while, trying to start over somewhere new. I don't know if it'll work, but I have to try. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I meant what I said in the warehouse. I tried to protect you, even when I made mistakes. There are still things I haven't told you, things I wish I could take back. Maybe someday, when we're both ready, I'll tell you the rest. But until then, I hope you find a way to move on. You deserve that much. Thank you for everything. And goodbye, Sarah." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer next to the voice recorder I hadn't been able to bring myself to destroy. Her words left me with more questions than answers, but they also left me with a sense of finality that I hadn't felt in months. I stood by the window, watching the city lights blur into the night, and for the first time, I let myself hope that maybe I could leave the shadows behind. But deep down, I knew that the scars of what had happened would never fully fade, that they would follow me like echoes of a story that refused to end.